In the midst of the Battle of Crecy, chaos reigns supreme. Edward, the future Black Prince, finds himself surrounded by the clash of swords and the cries of men. His outnumbered forces are pressed on all sides by the relentless French assault. The 16-year-old prince fights like a lion. Surrounded by his loyal knights and men-at-arms, Edward struggles tirelessly, his sword flashing in the melee as he seeks to stem the relentless tide of French attackers. Each swing of his blade is met with equal force from his adversaries, the din of battle drowning out all other sounds, save for the desperate calls of wounded and dying men. Amidst the turmoil, a lone messenger fights his way through the melee, seeking aid to the beleaguered prince. Finally reaching the strategic reserve where the King of England, Edward III, observes the chaos. The messenger urgently implores the king to come to his son's aid.
Before we start, my three cats and I want to thank our first ever sponsor. War Thunder is an epic free-to-play multiplayer game offering intense battles across land, sea and air on PC, PlayStation, Xbox and Mac. Experience adrenaline-pumping combat with tanks, planes, helicopters and ships spanning the mid-20th century to today. With immersive graphics and dynamic gameplay, War Thunder captures war's essence with Hollywood-like intensity. It features military technologies like guided missiles, reconnaissance drones and even nuclear strikes. You can also engage in various combat roles, from tank assaults to aerial dogfights, all on the same map. Customize your vehicles with additional modules and visual elements, ensuring it stands out on the battlefield. War Thunder's damage model provides realistic feedback for every hit, eliminating gamey health bars. Recent updates like Alpha Strike introduce Hungarian aviation and new equipment, enhancing visual effects and refining gameplay based on player feedback. Prepare for battles on the new North Holland map, fight in the Red Light District, or unleash chaos in the destructible shopping center. Download War Thunder for free via the link in the description. New players, those away for 6 months or more, receive special bonuses, rentals for the P-40, E-1 aircraft and M4 tank for a week, along with 3 unique schemes, a special decorator, 100,000 silver lions, 3 premium vehicles, a week of premium account, and more gifts. Hurry, the American vehicle bonus season is ending soon.
The 14th century witnessed a monumental clash between England and France. This blood feud of the two most prominent European monarchies is known as the 100 Years' War. But the seeds of this conflict were sown in the 11th century, after the Norman conquest of 1066. Since then, the English monarchs held titles and lands in France, making them vassals of the French monarchy. It was only a matter of time before the powerful monarchies with intertwined and unbalanced dynastic relations would collide. Things came to a head in 1337. During this period, the crown of England was held by a remarkable and strong-willed monarch, Edward III. His reign left a lasting impression and was regarded by many as one of the greatest kings to wear the English crown. Tied by blood to the French royal family, he had a legitimate claim to the French crown. When a political crisis erupted in Flanders and later in Brittany, competing nobles disfavored by the French King Philip VI switched their allegiance, turning to Edward for assistance. On the 24th of May, Philip, backed by his Great Council in Paris, agreed that the lands held by Edward in France should be taken back into Philip's hands, citing Edward's violation of his obligations as a vassal. Edward retaliated by claiming the French throne itself, being related to the French line of succession through his mother. The 100 Years' War had begun. There followed many years of intermittent and costly warfare, with Edward campaigning 3 times in northern France to little effect. The few successes, including a great naval victory at the Battle of Sluis in 1340, did little to alleviate his financial problems. Seriously strained by the prolonged, inconclusive fighting, nevertheless, the English king was able to rebuild his Flemish alliances, and his allies held most of Brittany. Gascony, however, was left to its own devices, and the French managed to damage vital trade with England through effective attritional warfare. Despite the relative isolation of the English in Gascony, the local ruler achieved a series of successes against the French, even capturing numerous towns, expanding the strategic depth of the English possessions. In March of 1346, a formidable French army numbering between 15,000 and 20,000 soldiers that significantly outnumbered any force the Anglo-Gascons could muster and included the entirety of the royal household, military officers, set forth under the command of John, Duke of Normandy, heir to Philip VI. Their target, Gascony. The strategically vital town of Aiguillon found itself under siege, becoming a focal point for both logistical and strategic considerations. On the 2nd of April, the Arrière-Ban, a formal call summoning of all able-bodied males to arms, resonated across the southern reaches of France. In response, the English ruler of Gascony urgently sent a plea for assistance to Edward. The call for help wasn't merely a moral obligation, but a contractual necessity dictated by the indenture between Edward and Gascony. According to the terms, if Gascony faced overwhelming odds, then Edward was bound to intervene and provide aid in one form or another. Simultaneously, Edward mobilized a new army, marshalling over 700 vessels for its transportation, a fleet of unparalleled size in English history up to that point. The French, aware of Edward's endeavors, sought to safeguard against the potential of an English invasion in northern France by relying on their formidable navy. However, this reliance proved futile, as the French failed to thwart Edward's successful channel crossing. The English landed in the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy on July 12, 1346, orchestrating a masterful strategic surprise, catching the French off guard. With complete unpredictability, they advanced southward, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Caen, a vital hub for culture, politics, religion and finance in the northwest Normandy, was eventually captured by storm on July 26th, enduring 5 days of looting. The toll was severe, with over 5,000 French soldiers and civilians losing their lives. Among the few captives was Raoul, Count of Eu, the Constable of France. By July 29th, Edward dispatched his fleet back to England, laden with plunder, while ordering reinforcements, supplies and funds to be gathered and sent to rendezvous with his army at Crotoy, on the north bank of the river Somme. The English, setting out towards the river Seine on August 1st, presented a formidable challenge to the beleaguered French. Meanwhile, the French faced a precarious military situation. Duke John of Normandy, leading their main army, was entrenched in a challenging siege of Aiguillon in the southwest. Edward, taking advantage of the surprise landing, wreaked havoc on some of the wealthiest lands in France, showcasing his ability to maneuver freely through the country. On August 2nd, a contingent of English and Flemish forces invaded France from Flanders, exploiting the inadequate French defences in the region. With the French treasury nearly depleted, Philip VI proclaimed the Arrière-Ban for northern France on July 29th, summoning every able-bodied male to assemble at Rouen. Paris, swollen with refugees, prepared for a street-by-street defense. As the English approached the Seine on August 7th, tensions escalated. By August 12th, Edward's army camped at Poissy, 20 miles from Paris, leaving a swath of destruction in its wake. On the other side of the Seine, Philip's army steadily reinforced its position. Paris, in chaos, braced for the impending conflict. Philip proposed a battle on August 14th, but Edward, without committing himself, hinted at a meeting south of the Seine. On August 16th, as the French positioned themselves, Edward burned down Poissy, destroyed the bridge, and marched north. Implementing a scorched earth policy, the French stripped the area of food, forcing the English to forage widely, where they became vulnerable to attacks by French peasants. Philip reached the river Somme ahead of Edward, positioning himself at Amiens and fortifying every bridge and ford between Amiens and the sea. The English found themselves trapped in an area devoid of sustenance, forced to forage whatever they could find, thus being significantly slowed down. Edward, determined to break the French blockade, attempted various points of attack, facing resistance at Hangest and Pont-Remy. During the night, the English marched to a tidal ford, Blanche attack, defended by 3,500 French. After a brief, intense skirmish, the English emerged victorious. While the main French army pursued the English, Flemish efforts to besiege Bethune faltered, leading to their withdrawal on August 24th. Edward, learning that he would not be reinforced by the Flemings, decided to face Philip's army with his current force. Evading immediate pursuit, King Edward III marched his army through familiar territory and arrayed his forces in a defensive position near the village of Crécy. The French, having crossed the Somme at the bridge in Abbeville, relentlessly pursued the English once more. The English king deployed his army in a very strong position, facing southeast on a sloping hillside. The left flank of the army was protected by the village of Wadicourt, while the right was covered by Crécy and the river May beyond, making it almost impossible for the French to outflank him. While waiting for the French to arrive at the battlefield, the English dug pits in front of their entrenched positions, intended to disrupt a potential cavalry charge, and the longbowmen took cover behind sharpened wooden stakes. The English army was divided into 3 battle groups. The king's son, Edward, Prince of Wales, the man who would later be known as the Black Prince, commanded the vanguard with 2,000 archers, 800 men-at-arms, and around 1,000 foot soldiers, including many Welsh. The left wing was led by the Earl of Arundel, who commanded a similarly composed force of longbowmen, men-at-arms, and foot soldiers. Behind them, the king himself commanded a reserve force of around 700 men-at-arms and 2,000 archers stationed near a windmill. Additionally, Edward ordered the construction of a fortified camp behind the army that would serve as a rallying point in case of a defeat and as a supply depot for arrows. The English were also equipped with a new weapon, the cannon. Crécy was to be one of the earliest battles where cannons were used. In total, the English army numbered around 15,000 men. By the time the English were heavily entrenched and prepared, elements of the French began to arrive on the battlefield. The exact size of the French army isn't known. Contemporary chroniclers give a wide range of numbers, but according to modern estimates, the French were around 25,000 men strong, with the army being a mix of approximately 10,000 mounted men-at-arms, 2,000 Genoese crossbowmen, and an unknown number of common foot soldiers. After briefly reconnoitering the enemy position, the French command considered giving battle the next day, when the entire army would have been properly rested, but it was not to be. either because of Philip's design or the army's impetuosity, and despite being late in the afternoon, the French army moved to the attack, unfurling their sacred banner, the oriflamme, which indicated that no invader would be taken prisoner. The French king ordered the Genoese crossbowmen forward, despite lacking their large pavise shields that were still a few kilometers behind the baggage train. To the sound of drums, the Genoese moved forward. As they advanced, a sudden rainstorm broke out that eventually weakened the crossbow strings, reducing their effectiveness. When the Genoese came in range, the longbows, a storm of arrows was unleashed by the prepared English. Unfortunately for the Genoese, who lacked their protective shields, they were also outranged and outmatched in terms of the rate of fire by the longbowmen. An additional challenge was the muddy ground that impeded their ability to reload, further slowing their rate of fire. Unable to withstand the onslaught for long, the Italians were defeated and fled. What followed next is disputed, but it is said that the division of mounted knights that was now charging behind the crossbowmen tried to press through their retreating allies. Their leader, who was the king's brother, Count Alençon, seeing the retreating Genoese and thinking that they betrayed them, shouted, "Round down this rabble who block our advance." The ensuing clash disrupted the already disorganized and impulsive uphill charge of the French knights, who now had to cross the no man's land under a relentless storm of arrows. Additional damage was inflicted by the pits dug by the English, making their horses trip, throwing their riders and impeding the path for the rest of their comrades. The constant hail of arrows was particularly devastating for the horses that were unarmored, causing many of them to fall, spilling or trapping their riders and exacerbating their disorder. By the time the French knights had reached the English men-at-arms, the charge had lost much of its impetus. What followed was brutal hand-to-hand combat, with contemporary chroniclers describing it as a horrible, cruel and pitiless brawl. Men-at-arms who lost their footing or were thrown from wounded horses were trampled underfoot, crushed by falling horses and suffocated in the mud. Alençon was among those killed in combat. And the first French attack was beaten off. The English gave no quarter, taking no prisoners and dispatching the wounded and dying French, looting their bodies. Yet, the disaster of the first wave only seemed to have encouraged further impromptu attacks by the French mounted men-at-arms. Among the most famous was the charge of the blind King John of Bohemia. He tied his horse to those of his attendants and charged into the thick of the fight, wanting to personally participate in the melee. His charge was particularly fierce and directed against the division led by the young Prince of Wales, who was only 16 years old at the time. It is said that at one point the prince was beaten to his knees, but the timely intervention of his standard-bearer saved his life. Amidst the horrific medieval carnage, a messenger wrote to King Edward asking him to assist the prince's hard-pressed men. Edward famously replied, "I order that the lad be allowed to earn his purse, for it is my wish, if the day be his, the glory of it belongs to him, and those in whose charge I have entrusted him." Indeed, it wasn't long before the future Black Prince was able to stabilize the situation, thwarting the momentum of King John's charge. Eventually, all were dragged from their horses and killed. The battlefield was now littered with dead and wounded, and dusk had almost fallen of the battlefield. Yet the French would not give up. After many ever more disjointed and uncoordinated cavalry charges. It was now King Philip that gathered around him whatever forces he could muster and charged in yet another desperate frontal attack. The French king fought bravely in a futile and losing battle, having 2 horses killed under him and even receiving an arrow in the jaw. The bearer of the sacred oriflamme, a particular target for English archers, fell, losing the banner that was soon captured. With nightfall approaching and his army in tatters, Philip was finally forced to abandon the battlefield, with the majority of the remaining French army melting away. It was an unprecedented disaster for the French, with losses amounting to at least 10,000 dead, including an unknown number of common infantry soldiers. At the same time, it was a total victory for the English king, whose triumph at Crecy would go down in history as one of the most impressive military victories ever achieved. The English losses were comparably minor, not exceeding 300 dead and wounded. As darkness fell, King Edward famously set alight the Windmill to lighten up the battlefield, helping his army dispatch the wounded and capture any remaining French knights among the heaps of dead. With the threat of the French army now removed, Edward ended the campaign by marching north at a slow pace, and eventually laying siege to and capturing Calais. The Battle of Crecy might have been won, but the 100 Years' War had just begun.